Hello and happy Friday, and thanks for tuning into RadioFreeRhinecliff.org. And this show in particular, correct me if I'm Norm, I'm your host, Norm, and I'm thrilled to be here tonight with Father Richard McKeon from Rhinebeck's own Episcopalian Church.
Great to be here.
Richard, thanks for being here.
Loving.
One of the questions that everybody asked, like, was it father or pastor or reverend or what are the terms that people can use?
Well, the church always tries to confuse people as much as possible.
Smart.
So the title is the Reverend. And when you're actually speaking to someone, it's father or mother, depending on whether they're man or woman.
And so when your parishioners are speaking to you, like after church, or they come in, whatever, hello, Father.
Usually Richard or Father Richard.
Yeah. And do you have a preference?
Richard's great.
Okay, good. I'm going to go with that. And here's a question: what is Right Reverend? I've heard that in the past.
That's a bishop.
Oh,
yeah. We love those hierarchies. So the Right Reverend is a bishop. The Very Reverend is a dean.
Which is higher than a bishop.
Oh no! Don't ever tell a bishop that, you'll get smacked. So the dean is below a bishop.
The dean is by the bishop.
The dean is usually in charge of a cathedral.
Okay,
which is where the bishop has their place, but the dean is actually kind of in charge of the cathedral in terms of running the liturgies and doing the services. So the bishop is in charge of the whole diocese, which is all the parishes in that Episcopal church in that area.
Okay. And you're in charge of this church here.
Just this one at the moment.
And you're a deacon?
No, priest.
A priest, a rector?
I am the rector. And again, more. See, the problem is the Episcopal Church has its origins in the English Church, the Anglican Church.
Okay.
So we took many of the same terms that came out of that tradition, which really don't have much of a bearing in America. In England, there are bishops and rectors and vicars and curates, all these titles that are old medieval titles. We have some of them. So a rector is in charge of the congregation and full-time. An assistant would be like a curate. The best thing is to read some Trollope novels, and you get the whole picture of what the Anglican Church.
Well, I have you here. I can just ask.
Well, I can just I can unpack it for you.
Yeah. So you're a rector. Are there other official sort of church employees here in Rhinebeck?
Well, the Church of the Messiah has a staff, and then most of the other, Hyde Park has a rector, and most of the other churches are smaller and part-time, so they would have a priest in charge.
Okay.
Which again sounds like more important authority, but it's actually not as big a job as having a full-time job.
We got a whiteboard right here next to it. We could just draw a whole chart.
A diagram is really helpful.
So a rector takes a priest. Priest can move one square side to side. A rector can jump.
Yes, exactly. Yep. Checkmate.
Yeah. And how did you get into this?
Well, I grew up an Episcopalian.
Okay.
I grew up in Westchester County, and my parents and my grandparents were both churchgoers. So I grew up with my parents going to church every Sunday, being active in their parish, actually having a wonderful parish experience as a kid. I then went away to college and would go occasionally to the local Episcopal church in the town. Moved to New York after I graduated from college and found a little Episcopal church. I lived on the Upper West Side and started going to that church. It was in the 70s, and they needed a church school teacher. So being naive, I thought, I'll teach church school. My parents had. And it was then that with the kids asking questions in church school that I began to actually think about my answers when they would say, well, did this really happen in the Bible? Is this a real story or a made-up story? Or why did this happen? It was the first time, interestingly enough, in my life of faith that I'd actually thought about my religion rather than just living it and going to church because my parents did. And in doing that, I found myself more deeply connected to the congregation there on the West Side and spoke to the priest there about the possibility of becoming a priest. And that began the process, which is usually a 3 or 4 year process of discernment. And then went on from there.
Discernment. And
Discernment, like there's a committee in the diocese that interviews people who are interested in becoming ordained, and they help them to see if they're really called to a ministry of ordination or to stay as lay people doing ministry.
Okay. Sounds like a pop quiz. I mean, how
More
do
like
they...
hazing, actually.
Yeah, hazing. So how is that determined? What happened that made you think more resolved that this is the path you want, and that convinced them that this was the path you really should be on?
I think sort of living out, being very authentic in my answers. So if I said I had a good job, I was working in New York, so I use the conversations that I had with committee members to kind of test my vocation and think about it and reflect on it without ever being desperate to become a priest.
Right.
My life didn't, I knew I'd have a life. If they turned me down, for example, I'd be able to be part of the church.
Right.
But it helped focus my thinking about what gifts I might bring as a priest, what I would like doing as a priest. But in the end, you don't really know until you start doing it. There's only so much theory that you can, and abstract speculation about whether you'll be a good priest. You don't really know until you start doing it,
Right.
whether it really resonates and if you're good at it.
And was it a period of heightened introspection for you to really make sure this
was. I mean, you have to jump through a lot of hoops and talk to a lot of people. And so the trick there is not to have the same questions that come up again and again be repetitive or rote, to really try to think of what's behind the question and speak to that. Otherwise, you begin to sound a little robotic.
Yeah. And was there formal training involved?
Oh, yeah. No, the Episcopal Church requires all the people that are ordained to attend divinity school or a seminary and to receive a master's in theology. So what I ended up doing was going to a English theological college for 2 years, and then came back and finished up at Yale Divinity, which was the deal that I worked out with the bishop in New York.
Amazing. And so you went away to West Yorkshire in England, and you studied there for 2 years.
Yeah.
And that seems like a great place for sort of Episcopalian studies.
It was if you were a man. At the time, Church of England was not ordaining women.
Okay.
So it was all men, but that college was very progressive. So it had a plan in place as soon as women could be trained for the priesthood to incorporate women into that college. And they have.
And when did it happen that Episcopalians began ordaining women?
That's a great question. They started doing it before the church had one mind about it.
Right.
So in the 1970s, a group of women were ordained in Philadelphia. And they did it without the official sanctioning of the church, but it pushed the church to move as a body to approve the ordination of women.
Okay.
So it was kind of a radical effort to force the question.
Radical nudge.
And it worked.
And was the church, I can't imagine the church was sort of unified.
No, the 70s was a really hard decade for the Episcopal Church. Before then, I think our membership nationally was like 3 million. Still small. But in the 1970s, they did 3 things, which fell within that decade, that all of which meant that there was a loss of membership over each step. One was the ordination of women. Another was the ordination of gay men and women. And then we also revised our prayer book. The prayer book hadn't been changed since 1928.
Right.
The Episcopal Church never moves too fast. So they thought, 50 years, time for a new prayer book. And that change had a sort of seismic effect on the church. There were people who were wedded to the old prayer book and didn't like the new prayer book, and they left. So there was a large exodus, both because of progressive stands and also changes within the church. So then later, as the American church continued on its progressive stance on social issues, there began to be breakaway Episcopalians that would break from the Episcopal Church of the United States and form their own denomination. And those breakaway churches also were in response to the liberal stance of the Episcopal Church. So they were much more conservative.
More conservative. And are they still out there?
Yeah, they're around different places, under rocks, different places.
Just not in Rhinebeck.
Not in Rhinebeck, no.
But there's a national church organization somewhere.
For the Episcopal Church?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And
the center is in New York City.
Okay. And the breakaway churches are part of that?
No, they have nothing to do with the Episcopal Church. There have been famous lawsuits about who the property belongs to when they break away and those sort of things. But the
property, like the church building.
Yes.
Not the intellectual property of the name Episcopalian.
Right. So they generally, again, this is all vocabulary 101, but the worldwide communion of which we're a part as the National Episcopal Church in the United States is part of an Anglican communion worldwide. So the Anglican Church is just a fancy word for English. Wherever the English empire basically was, there was an Anglican church. Canada, Australia, South Africa, the United States, and of course in Great Britain. When they broke away, they took the name Anglican and so if you look, they'll say something like Continuing Anglican Church in North America. It's not the real deal.
It's funny. Wow. So in the 70s, when all this happened, when they welcomed female priests and gay priests and updated the prayer book, and people were like, we can't do that, and they left. You were left with a mass of congregants of who were okay with change and evolving.
Yeah.
And that sounds like a pretty good core group to have.
Absolutely. It changed the nature and the dynamic of the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church had always been a progressive denomination within the Protestant kind of umbrella. But the more radical progressivism that became part of our, I think, tradition, and it's certainly true at Church of the Messiah, emerged from this core of values that were around progressivism and liberalism, basically around social justice.
Right.
So this, in the 70s, the continuing struggle for civil rights had moved from demonstrations to it actually more living into an attempt to solve social justice issues systemically. And the church was very involved in that. So on issues that emerged later in the 80s against apartheid and on issues of women's rights, reproductive rights, all the Episcopal Church always took a progressive stand.
Right.
Which was and it gave us, the greatest thing it gave us was a clear identity. The old joke was the Episcopal Church was the Republican Party at prayer. And after the 70s, we became identified with this socially concerned activist church, which was wonderful in terms of the way I see it.
Right. And people, your church here is a beautiful old stone building. And people would pass it driving north out of the village on Route 9 there.
Right. No accident.
No
place there.
Yeah. And there's almost always some sort of sign in front. Yeah. Right now, I think it's like We Stand With Ukraine or something. Before that, I didn't even know, like Black Lives Matter.
Hate has no home here.
There's always something there. And it's really great advertising from my perspective as to what the church is about.
Yep.
And go on.
And so the trick with that is it's very important to have a public face.
Yeah.
So if you look, our signboard is tiny. You can't really read what it says. That's okay. We want to be able to position where we are in terms of social issues, whether they're immigration advocacy, or gay rights, or any position that we've taken in terms of racism. That's great. The most important thing, though, frankly, is not just the signage, but the actual action of the congregation.
Sure.
So it's what I love is we put the sign out on the lawn,
Right.
but that sign represents a real ministry and position and action that the church is taking
Right.
in concrete terms.
Which is amazing. And the signs, is that something you started during your...
Yeah. I love me a billboard, so...
Good billboard. And that doesn't run afoul of any local zoning?
Oh, well, yes. Funny you mention that. Sometimes it does.
Have you ever gotten a slap on the wrist?
We've gotten slapped on the wrist. When I first got there, every organization in the congregation would put a little sign up. So there'd be like rummage sale, Bible school, come Easter services. And so finally, I think they thought we were a bit of a eyesore. So we were told, scale it back. We've never and again, what I love about Rhinebeck is we've never been asked to take any of our banners down.
Right.
Which is great. So we're mindful of being on the main street in Rhinebeck, but we're also mindful of how many people have said they really appreciate and love that affirmation.
I do. It's wonderful. And I'm curious, has that brought in new members for the church?
Increases I believe that growth in congregations comes from clear identity. So if you know what that church is, you're more likely to grow.
And these things help define who you are.
It defines who we are. So it certainly has helped that. And it's also that with other programs that we've done. But it's certainly, we often have gotten the fact that people notice that even more than the church building necessarily, which is very pretty and very beautiful. But the Episcopal Church architecture was not meant to be startling or attention-getting. It was just meant to make you think of England.
Right. Right. And it doesn't really... I would say it sort of goes to the opposite of defining your identity. It's like, that's a staid, conservative, old stone building kind of church.
Right. Messiah was on a track from its inception when it was founded and built by the wealthy families of Rhinebeck. The Astors, the Sukleys, the Mortons were all active members at Messiah. And then through the 20th century, the church was built by John Jacob Astor IV in memory of his father, William. And his mother, Carolyn, who was in The Gilded Age as one of those characters that played in the series, controlled the New York social scene to 400 people that could fit into her ballroom.
Right.
So she was obviously a holy terror and was a member of the congregation. I'm so grateful not to be the rector in 1910 of the congregation, because I wouldn't have made it to her ballroom, I'm sure. But those families, once those families in their presence in Rhinebeck began to fade by the middle of the 20th century, Messiah was probably faced with two choices. We could either be kind of a country club church, the way many Episcopal churches were perceived, or we could be this radically welcoming, open congregation. And my predecessor, Jerry Gallagher, really took the church in the direction of being open and taking significant social stands on issues. I like to think that we've built on that foundation. But that was a critical turning point. And I think we would have died if we had stayed as a staid country club, comfortable, parish.
Right.
We would not be where we are now.
And how is the membership? Is the congregation growing?
Yeah, it's good.
And apart from sort of the billboards that you like out there in Route 9, do you do any sort of outreach? I mean, in one way, it's a business. You need people to bring in some money so that you can get the church, so you can pay salaries and all that stuff. Do you do anything to sort of like bring in?
I tap dance every Sunday morning in front of the church.
I didn't read that on the church website when I was looking at you.
You gotta shake that.
That's good.
But the best advertising is actually through real experience and word of mouth. That's when people move to town. If they are looking for a community of faith, they'll say, "Well, what's this parish like or church like?"
Right.
And that identity then is shared, and people come and see.
And so when people move to town, bet that if they're Episcopalian, they come there first. But then people, there's a Methodist church, I think, and a Catholic church, and that some people probably go to those and think, well, this is not quite right, and maybe find their way to other churches, to yours.
We hope so. Yeah. What's happened that's interesting in the Protestant sort of spectrum is there's been this homogenization of what the churches are like. So they're very similar. Back early 100 years ago, you could have pretty defined what kind of church you were in by the liturgy, by music, by a whole bunch of different traditions. That's changed quite a bit. And now, you'd be hard pressed necessarily to say, am I in a Presbyterian church? Am I in a Reformed church? Until you really dug into the congregation and sort of knew more about it. What the Episcopal Church, what we've done in terms of our growth, are emphasizing two areas that seem to meet the needs of people in our area, in Rhinebeck and the surrounding areas. One is that many of the people are coming from New York City. So they're used to a level of music, for example, that's of a fairly high standard. So we have purposely positioned ourselves with putting our resources towards a really first-rate music program. And we have section leaders from Bard, the Music Conservatory at Bard, as well as a volunteer choir. And my husband, who happens to be the music director, has done a great job of building up the music program. So when people come, that's one of the word of mouth things is, oh, Messiah's got a great music program. If you like good music, give them a try. The other thing is that people in my generation, people in their 60s, when they retire, and there is one of Rhinebeck's demographics is it's a great place to retire to because of being a great community, having health services.
Right.
But one of the things people look at in my generation is opportunities to volunteer. So if you're a parish that has a lot of programs that have involved community service or social justice, that's another opportunity that people are looking for and connects them with the congregation as well.
Right.
And then finally, the other area is in church school and in young families. But our biggest growth, we have a program for children and families and young people. But our biggest growth are people moving out of the city in their 50s or 60s or 70s, and that demographic is our biggest new membership growth.
Interesting. And you mentioned service a couple of times. One of the things you do is this food bank, I think.
Food pantry.
Food pantry, mm-hmm. five days a week.
Nope, just one.
Just one?
Just Friday.
Oh, just Fridays.
Just
Why
Fridays.
Did I think it was more often than that?
It's open on Fridays from 10 to 1 in our parish hall parking lot. Since COVID, we've been outside distributing the food from within the parish hall. But what's been great in COVID has been that we didn't miss a single day of distributing food. So what's unusual about our food pantry is that we're not on a cycle of you can only come every 2 or 3 weeks. People can come week after week. And that was a change we made in COVID so that people who needed food. And we did it initially because of the nature of COVID and not trying to have when, the virus first was in our community, there was great concern about even conversation, people talking and exposure. Right. So we tried to limit the conversation. So what we would do is we would give food without all the usual documentation, and the organization that helps us supply food, the Food Bank of New York, then as the virus, as time within COVID progressed, said we really do have to start having that documentation again. So we've put that back. But what was great is that I believe the shutdown in the county was March 12th or 13th of 2020. It was a Thursday night. And that Thursday afternoon, we just by chance had a meeting with the steering committee of the food pantry to say, well, what if we get shut down? How can we make sure we keep giving out food? So we had a plan in place. In the afternoon that night, the county executive said no more than 10 people can gather. There was this kind of lockdown, and we still gave out food the next day, and we never shut to recalibrate. And so in 2021, we gave out 72 tons of food.
Wow.
We average, at the height of the pandemic, we were averaging 70 or 80 families, and each family could be as many as 3, 4, 5, 6 people in a family. So we were giving out tremendous amounts of food. We turned the parish hall over completely to be a warehouse for food. Right. So there were no other events happening. So we made it completely available for more food storage. And things have settled a bit. We were averaging around 50 families. But there has been an uptick in this past year because of the cost of food and inflation and fuel. So people are having to make hard choices about how they spend what limited resources they have, whether they eat or stay warm.
And so how many families, say, today?
Today we probably, I didn't look at the numbers before I came over, but we probably have between 50 and 60 families.
Right. And you mentioned the Food Bank of New York. Are they the number one source of the food that you pass on?
They are a source in our area for distributing to food pantries, basically selling them food at lowered cost.
Okay.
So it is a way of accessing food in sort of a wholesale way. It's a governmental organization that provides in our area of the Hudson Valley food for all the various food pantries, and so we pick up food there on a regular basis.
And local farmers, do they?
That's a great question. What we've tried to do is really encourage locally sourced fresh food, because most of the food that would come from the food bank would be not fresh.
Right.
This may be too much detail, but in the pandemic, it was clear that there was a need for things like milk. So we hadn't been giving out dairy before then. We bought a new gigantic refrigerator, and initially we were over at the Dutchess County Fairgrounds because they had massive refrigeration units. So we were giving out dairy through them. At the same time, we were distributing food from the church. And then when that began to wind down, we brought them back into the church on Fridays to give out the milk. But we've got a number of farmers that bring, especially obviously during the growing season, tremendous amounts of fresh food. So we're able to lay out for people this great choice of fresh fruit and vegetables from the spring right through the fall.
Right.
And then organizations like Bread Alone donate their bread. So there's a lot of support from local community, as well as donations from the community, which is tremendous.
It's amazing. And you said that you buy food at wholesale prices from the Food Bank of New York.
Yep.
And that makes me wonder about sort of the operating budget of the church and where your funds come from to buy food from there, to keep the building up. And
So the budget for the food pantry is separate from the operating budget of the church. That's because donors who give money to the food pantry are giving it specifically for the food pantry.
nice.
So it's not for the operating line of the budget, which
Right,
would pay my salary and the heat or electricity and things. So we keep those two budgets separate. It's not a separate 501c3. It's still under the umbrella of the church, but a separate accounting and accounting for their funds. So that is, there's a bit of money that comes in through grants, but that is almost exclusively from individual donations.
Nice.
And there's, even before COVID, there was a very generous donor base in our community towards our food pantry. And it's grown considerably. So it's a very vibrant, healthy organization within the church. The church money comes almost exclusively from, again, pledges or donations of members, with a small amount coming from use of space from a piece of real estate we own. That we own the dry cleaners, and that's on Montgomery Street. So
that's
we get
great.
some rent from that. But most of our budget is just almost at $500,000 for the church budget.
It seems pretty small.
Big value for money.
There you go.
And for what we do, it is. So I'm the only clergy staff person. We have a part-time parish secretary, a part-time church musician and choir director. We've had a part-time staff person for youth ministry. And I have an associate, Reverend Gwyneth Murphy, who's retired, who gives her time to be part of the staff, but she's on a volunteer basis.
Nice.
Appreciate.
And the gardens and the landscaping, and
We have dedicated members who work on all that's volunteer.
that's great. It is such a beautiful place.
Thank you.
Your church. Now, how did you come to be there? You'd been somewhere else prior to
Downriver, in Dobbs Ferry.
Yeah.
My progression in ministry has been from Yonkers, Dobbs Ferry to Rhinebeck. So next stop will probably be Albany.
They're going to love you in Albany, yeah.
Actually, next stop will be retirement, because we have to retire by 72, and I'm 67.
You do?
Yeah,
Says who?
the National Church.
Really?
Yeah.
72. That's
Pick us out at 72.
Huh. Wow.
So clock's ticking.
Yeah. So how many more years do you have?
As long as I can tap dance. So I have about 5 more years, 4.5 more years. So I have to retire.
You're never going to beat that Gallagher guy's record, are you?
Well, I'm going to give my shot.
Yeah, all right, good.
No, I won't be 22 years at Messiah. But the it's the Episcopal system for deployment, which is what the word is for hiring clergy, is very much like corporate America. They advertise the position nationally. Clergy who are interested apply, and there's a search committee that's formed to go through all the applications, to also put together a profile of the parish, so that the priests who are interested in the job can read a condensed sort of survey of what the parish is like. Mm-hmm. It also helps the parish decide what they might be looking for in a new priest.
Right.
Whether they want to continue things or take a different direction, helps them define themselves. And then they have interviews. And after that, they narrow it down to a smaller pool of people that they look at. And then they submit 2 or 3 names to the board of directors, which in the Episcopal Church is called the vestry. They vote and offer the job to the person, and they take it or not.
And here you are.
Here I am.
And why did you want out of Dobbs Ferry?
Well, I've been there 22 years.
Right.
Same amount as Jerry Gallagher.
Yeah.
And I was 55 when I took this job. And I was having a conversation with our bishop in New York, and he said, if you do want to look, I know you're happy in Dobbs Ferry, but if you do want a different parish experience, this is probably it. Because once you hit your late 50s, early 60s, the parish knows that 72,
Right.
you're done. So if they want a longer stretch of ministry with you, it narrows the places open to you. So he said, I know this great parish in Rhinebeck where this wonderful priest has just retired, and I think you'd be a good match. Would you be interested in applying? And
So the bishop was sort of headhunting you for this job.
yeah, I mean, he knows his clergy, and although he has no say in sending people the way they would in other denominations, he certainly would say, I think you'd be great in this parish. He probably would not say to the parish, this person would be great. He'll leave that up to the parish. But he might say to the priest, do you know about Rhinebeck? And at the time, my husband and I owned a house in Westchester, and Rhinebeck seemed so far from our lives there. Tim, my husband, was working in White Plains. I was in Dobbs Ferry. But I came up, I got the application in the last minute, the cutoff, which is typical of me anyway, but I got it in just under the wire. And but as soon as I began the process with the search committee, and then with the vestry as it continued, I fell in love with the parish immediately and wanted it more than anything in the world.
And you said the bishop had positioned it as sort of a different sort of experience than the Dobbs Ferry experience.
I think it was a different... The church in Dobbs Ferry was very small.
Okay.
And this was a much larger congregation.
Was that the main difference, size?
Also, suburban New York has its own sort of feel. The community is very dependent on New York City. Half the town leaves every morning at 6 and comes back at 6 in the evening. There's a little bit of that tidal pull to New York here, but not nearly like the suburbs. Yeah. So there's more of a set community. And I think also he understood my commitment to social justice and felt that Messiah would be a good landing place for both of us, both the parish and me, in terms of where we might go. And that was true all the way along. From the very first contact I had with the parish, I was bowled over by how responsive they were. Parishes tend to hold their cards close to their chest in terms of the process, not be very forthcoming with, oh God, that was great, or, it's like, thank you. And we have to produce, videos of our sermons and answer essay questions, and they get our resume and things. And right from the beginning, when I would send off a sermon or something to the search committee, most search committees would say, thank you very much for your sermon. We appreciate getting it. At Messiah, there would be people on the search committee who would say, really enjoyed listening or watching your sermon. And the poem that you chose is one that reminded me of another one by this poet.
Oh, that's
and I
sweet.
want to share that with you, because this is what I thought after I heard your sermon. And I thought, who wouldn't go to a parish where even in the process, they're giving you input and relating and connecting with you in a profound way? And I have to say, after 13 years, the honeymoon is long over. But that is exactly the parish. They are so present that it's very exciting to be there.
Nice. And do you do a poetry study group?
We do. We have a big poetry. We have a weekly. It grew, again, COVID changed things a bit. We were doing a Sunday morning poetry forum between the two main services at 9 on Sunday morning in person. And during COVID, we started doing it on Zoom. And now we have about 25 or 30 people on Zoom who we meet every Wednesday morning on Zoom for an hour. Anyone's welcome to join us. Just go to our website and you can sign up. But we change poets. So we've just finished Yeats. Mm-hmm. And this Wednesday, we're starting Langston Hughes. But we've done Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, We just sort of make our way with W.H. Auden. So we're kind of, when we do one poet for 2 or 3 months. And so we have a chance to really dig in. We'll do 1 or 2 poems each week, look at them intensely, line by line. And
that's nice. And
it's a great.
You studied that in college.
I probably would have been a teacher if the teaching recession in 1977 hadn't hit. All my professors at Middlebury said, rather than going on to graduate school to teach, you're going to end up checking in people at the Hyatt probably because there's no work. So why not do that job in New York first and then go to graduate school? And then in the intervening time is when I changed direction about what kind of graduate school I might go to. So
and what was the job in New York?
I worked at Tiffany's. It wasn't exactly the Hyatt.
Tiffany's. Nice, with Audrey
The Episcopal
Hepburn.
Church is very loath to sound elitist, but I can't be disloyal to Tiffany's. I did work at Tiffany's for 5 years.
And how was that? Was that a good gig?
Well, what I always say is same crowd, different altar.
Nice. Well, there you go. That's nice. So I guess it was probably
I loved it.
Yeah,
It was great. It was 1977.
And what were you doing there?
I was corporate sales.
Okay.
So
Corporate
Revlon
sales.
would give corporate gifts, and I would help them choose what it was going to be.
Oh, nice.
So we could sell anything in the store, not just a particular floor.
Right.
So it was great.
And then you got out of there. You got into this. You studied.
I went on to seminary right from Tiffany's. Yeah.
And what's the difference between seminary and divinity school?
Really, it's just, a seminary will tend to be more denominational. So the Episcopal seminaries are more steeped in the Episcopal tradition. A divinity school will have many traditions.
Okay.
So Yale Divinity will have many interfaith denominations participating in the program. A seminary tends to be, in the Episcopal tradition, just the Episcopalian. It isn't that only Episcopalians go, but they'll be steeped in an Episcopal ethos.
Right. That makes sense. And you went to both.
Yes, I did. Yeah, Yale Divinity was a great experience. The seminary in England, the theological college in England, was very small. It was 50 men being trained. Most of them were in for a 3-year program. So it was very small. And the reason I chose it was I'm, born Anglophile. I love England. But also I knew it was very structured and disciplined. And I knew that I would be best formed for the priesthood where I would have to take very seriously every aspect of my training rather than kind of gliding through or being sort of under the radar if things got difficult, So I was used to living for 5 years on my own in New York in 1977. So having a theological college such as the college in England, College of the Resurrection at Murfield, where you had to have permission to leave the campus.
Oh.
You had to be at services every morning at 6:00. If I remember once, I was called into. Everyone had a spiritual director, and my spiritual director called me in to say that at their staff meeting, they had noticed that my attention was wandering during the Bible reading, and that their suggestion was I should bring a Bible with me to follow versus letting my thoughts wander elsewhere. At Yale Divinity, they wouldn't have even known if I was in the building, let alone if my attention had wandered. So that kind of focus was exactly what I needed.
Interesting.
So and then Yale Divinity was great because it was this vibrant, large community of all different, diversity and
you would have been exposed to all kinds of different things.
All kinds of things.
Were you ever tempted to leave the Episcopalian fold and be a
not
Lutheran?
For a second.
Or
I have to say, not for a second. It's never occurred to me till this moment.
Tell us about. Oh, great! So when you sign your letter of resignation tomorrow,
life
you blame
change
me
on the radio.
Yeah. Well, that's nice, but it sounds like going to Yale would have been a little bit of a test. I was like, I'm going to expose myself to all of these thoughts and all these different paths. And
it was a much more, the education at Yale, besides being a very academically rigorous program, which, the school in England was too, but there was there was an academic profoundness to our professors and the courses, very conscious of the fact that we were at a university. But what was great was, again, it was the early 80s, mid 80s, and I was only there a year, but there was a profound influence on looking at systemic misogyny, systemic racism, the economic impact of racism, for example.
in the divinity school.
In the divinity school.
Right.
And so that whole opening up that awareness of how unconscious I was, given my privilege as a white upper middle class guy that had worked at Tiffany's and, been lucky enough to go to college, was tremendous. That was a real education in itself.
Right.
Was having people who were much more aware of the dynamics of privilege.
Right. Amazing. And were your folks fairly liberal?
Well, no. They were very loving and very supportive of me when I came out as a gay man. There was no question, not for a second.
Were you must have approached that with some modicum of trepidation, like, oh my God, what are they going to say?
Well, being Episcopalian, we couched it with several martinis at a nice French restaurant. So I could probably said anything as long as I ordered the right thing.
Mom, Dad, we're going out.
Yeah, let's go out for dinner.
Le Cochard.
Yeah, exactly. No, it was pretty bad. But no, in terms of their own personal support and love of me, that was unwavering. Politically, growing up, my parents were more conservative. I grew up during, sitting around the dinner table during the Civil Rights Movement and the war in Vietnam. So, of course, I was, even as an adolescent, challenging whatever my parents believed in. They could have been progressive and I would have been challenging them. But yeah, all those, I very quickly realized that I fundamentally disagreed with them on the stances they were taking at that time.
Were they against gay priests? And,
none of that. No.
Female priests? And
no, not female priests either. No, it was that conservatism that's born more of, I think probably for my parents, I don't necessarily want to speak, because my mother did have a conversion experience to a more progressive position. So she was always trying to hide my father's, absentee ballot later on. And she was canvassing for a party other than the one he supported. But I think that I think they were, in terms of politics, they were fiscally conservative in terms of how they saw the way the country should be run. But they were in good company. I mean, growing up in suburban New York, again, it was a fairly conservative time.
Yeah.
So when to their credit, they never shamed me or embarrassed me for disagreeing with them. I don't think they always liked my opinions, but they never said, you can't say them to us.
Right.
And that was, I think that came out of their being Episcopalian and that progressivism.
That's great.
So, growing up, our parish priest, the thing that drew me to the church, even before I was thinking of becoming a priest, which I never really thought of seriously until, again, after college, was we had a priest growing up in our town. I grew up in Ossining, who was incredibly fun. And so I remember my parents, when the priest would come for dinner, it wasn't a solemn kind of thing. It was a uproarious party. There was laughter. I was a kid. I had to go to bed. But I remember listening to my parents and their guests and our Episcopal priests laughing, telling stories, laughing at themselves, laughing at the church, but enjoying themselves so profoundly that was a model of how I wanted, when I thought about the priesthood, that's what I wanted to somehow also bring or embody.
Right. That's great. Bringing joy into the lives of the people around you.
It's not supposed to be divorced from our real experience, and laughter and humor is a huge part of our human experience.
All right, and now I wanted to ask about writing your sermons. You every week, I guess.
Try
50. You repeat some from years ago.
Well, not intentionally. In probably after about 10 or 15 years of ordination, I stopped writing my sermons because I felt that it felt more directly connected with the congregation to be speaking to them rather than to be reading to them. And there's no judgment on clergy who read their sermons. Some of the greatest sermons I've heard have been read. But for me, standing in the middle of the congregation without notes, speaking, felt much more direct. Now, when I prepare a sermon the week before, I'll look at the readings. In the Episcopal Church, we have set readings for every Sunday. We don't choose the readings. I'll look and see what the readings are for that Sunday. I'll have a week to think about it and let it kind of ruminate. On Friday or Saturday, I'll outline what I want to say, and I put it away. Sunday morning, I get up very early and re-outline it again, put that away, and then preach it.
Nice. And so this week is the Epiphany.
Uh-oh.
Like, damn, I forgot.
Shoot.
So will the Episcopalian Church sort of guide, say, hey, here's some ideas?
It's the story of the Magi and the wise men coming. Yeah.
Okay.
So we got the star, we got the wise men, we got the camels.
And so you were developing what you'll be saying on Sunday now.
Yes.
It'll be around that.
Yep.
And I'm guessing somehow you'll spin that historical story to contemporary relevance. And
it may be, egotistical on my part, but I think things that relate directly to my experience, if I'm able to share them, are more relatable than simply teaching a strictly theologically formed sermon. So if it has a theological reflection, all to the good, but I'll usually try to couch it in some story or real experience that I've had, and then put that in the context of what I understand to be the more profound meaning in the scripture or the day we're celebrating or recognizing. So I often tell the story in church. When I was down in Dobbs Ferry, a friend came up from the city one weekend to spend the weekend and came to church on Sunday. And I preached a sermon, and usually it was about something going on in my life, the dogs, gardens, whatever. And at the end of it, he said, when we were having lunch, he said, so does your congregation okay with your sermons? And I said, yeah, why? And he goes, well, you're like talking about your dogs. And I said, well, and he said, it really should be more serious, I think. So the following week, I evolved some sermon on some esoteric Christian doctrine, like the atonement or something, and had a very learned, very, very academic sermon that was very carefully prepared and written out, and I read from it. And on the way out, you can always tell when a congregation is annoyed because there's like this little buzz of like angry bees in the church. And people came out and they said, that was a terrible sermon. Why can't you go back to what you always talk about, which are dogs and gardens? So it's dogs and gardens.
There you go. And the Magi.
They'll work their way in.
Right.
Yep.
And the food pantry, which is sort of like the gifts of the Magi, I'm guessing. It seems a sort of parallel.
Yep. Sure.
Sure. Thanks. I appreciate that.
I'll file that away for Sunday.
Speaking of parallels and metaphors, you talked about the poetry study group, which sounds amazing. If I wanted to sign up for that, what was the URL I would go to?
Rhinebeck.episcopal. Good luck spelling Episcopal, but he'll spell check for you. At gmail.com.
Rhinebeck Episcopal at gmail.com. Okay.
And our website should pop up. Oh, that's the email, isn't it?
Yeah.
So as you can tell, tech is not I'm a traveler to the tech world, not a native born. So Rhinebeck.org, RhinebeckEpiscopal.org
is the website.
Call the office and Nicole will tell you what it is.
Google it.
Google Church of the Messiah Rhinebeck, and it'll pop right up.
And it'll take you to your website.
Pay no attention to what I say.
And people can sign up for the poetry.
Whatever they want to.
The poetry thing.
Absolutely.
That's amazing. So when you went to college and you studied American Studies with an emphasis in poetry and literature, and what did you think you might be doing?
Teaching.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to teach.
Coming out of high school, you were like, I want to be a teacher.
And I had fantastic professors. I went to Millbury College in Vermont and had just incredible professors that I wanted to do what they had done, which was change people's lives by being extraordinary teachers. The professors and the teachers I had at Middlebury, especially, shout out to John Elder in the English department. It was his first year of teaching, and he changed my life by making me feel that I had something to say, which I had not felt at all up till then in my education, that I had a voice and that what I had to say was worth hearing, and whether it was a paper or in class participation. And that affirmation was extraordinary. And then in coming out as a gay man, when I did at college, again in the early 70s, all of my professors and the college were incredibly supportive. So I just felt that I had this experience in teaching of making my life whole and healing a lot of things from that teaching was not simply communication of information, but could be at its most profound a life-changing experience.
Right. And so way back then when you had this sort of epiphany and thought, oh, I have something to say.
Epiphany, I can use that for Sunday.
Yeah, I'm just going to keep working that out.
Yeah, thank you.
What was that something to say that you realized you had?
I had a bad experience in high school. I went to we moved to Chappaqua in the early 1970s. And I, probably in my own immaturity at the time, but the feedback I got from one or two teachers there, I wasn't very happy in high school at all. I think because of my understanding that I was different because of my sexuality. And
had you come out to yourself at that point?
Yes. I mean, I knew from a very early age that I was attracted to men. Interestingly enough, in Westchester in the 1970s, as hard as it may be to believe, I thought I was the only person in the world who felt that way. I had no context of there being another gay man or a gay woman.
I think it's a special superpower of all teenagers to think they're the only ones.
Yeah, but there was I was convinced that I was the only person that felt that way, and therefore was very hidden.
Right.
Kept it very hidden, and the bullying and all that went on. But Chappaqua prided itself on the excellence of its public schools, and I somehow fell between the cracks in that, and was very unhappy in high school. So I came out of high school with no confidence in my own abilities. And John Elder and other professors that I had changed that by their feedback and encouragement.
Right. And so the thing that you felt you had to say all of a sudden was just that we can persevere, we can get over our difficulties, or?
Yeah, that my perception or my reading of a book could be valid or have be worthy of talking about. That my opinion about The Great Gatsby could matter, and perhaps even the discussion of it that we would have would be something that would be engaging and really enjoyable. College did not feel like academic work. It felt like salvation.
Right.
I just thrived in college. I just adored it, every minute of it.
That's so good.
And I think that probably, as I'm talking to you, I've never thought about this, but it probably was a good foundation for again, pursuing a vocation where I might have something to offer, and authenticity. And also, frankly, in an institution like the Episcopal Church that could accept me as a gay man. And not only accept me, but promote me and encourage me to succeed. It's not unlike my college experience.
Right. Great. Well, somehow we've reached the end of our hour together.
You're kidding.
And I'm not. It's been so much fun.
It's been a lot of fun.
I hope it's been fun for you. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. If you've tuned in, this has been Correct Me If I'm Wrong on radiofreerhinecliff.org. Thanks to the Epicurean for hosting us, as always. And special thanks to my guest, Father Richard McKeon, for being here and talking with us tonight.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, everybody. Good night. And a happy Epiphany.
Yes. Tune in.